Let me begin by telling you a little bit about the impulse behind this this panel, and because it leads to what these three people were asked to do. One came out of a conversation last year. President Uchtdorf came with his wife, Harriet, who was as a member of our advisory board. And people are always asking, what is Mormon art? It's sort of a perpetual question. And he said, you know, Mormon art includes Michelangelo, suggesting that it can be Mormon even if it's not made by Mormons. I think, of course, he's thinking of the creation story, which has a literal physical God creating a literal physical Adam. But it did raise the possibility that there will come a day when we will not be so parochial in our description of who belongs to us as a Mormon people. So the first assignment that went out to our three panelists was to describe some work of art in which you find spiritual dimensions not made by a Latter-day Saint artist of any kind. So we hope we'll get some sense of what they're doing, hoping that we all will sort of develop discernment in recognizing powerful resonances that we feel as Latter-day Saints or part of our spiritual lives that can be seen on the walls of any museum. So that was the first goal. And the second goal was for them to talk about their own work and how their own spiritual lives bubble up and somehow permeate the things that they are painting or composing or writing. I will just say one thing. As I've been dealing with artists more and more, I think that art can present another way to think about our spiritual lives. A lot of Mormon art that we see really repeats what we hear in Sunday school class. It's a picture of something that's familiar to us. And we just look at it and say, ah, there's Esther, or you know, there are the pioneers, or there's Nephi. And it sort of reinforces our memories. But I think, and tells us, gives a moral, tells us what is good, it's reassuring. But I think a lot of art is about asking a question, not giving an answer, but asking a question that makes us think again about who we are and what's our relationship. So that's the source of the title of our panel today, Art as Spiritual Inquiry. So we had some lovely people to speak to us. Christian Asplund teaches composition at BYU and is a distinguished composer himself, produced a number of works. And if you want to hear some of them, along with other lovely music, he and his wife, Melissa Heath, will be performing at a, I don't know, do we call it a jazz club or a music club or something? Performance space. Performance space, that's lovely. Called Spectrum, tomorrow night, Saturday, June 30th at 7 p.m. It's 70 Flushing Avenue, Brooklyn. Melissa, raise your hand so people know you. If you want a little sheet that gives you information on how to get to this performance space, Melissa will have one, or Christian will have.
There's some on the table downstairs.
Yeah, okay. That's good. Okay, so I think we'll just have you come up, Christian, and talk, and then I'll introduce our other people.
Well, to talk about a work that, I've got to time myself. Are we 12 or 10 minutes? I can't remember. 10, right. I had an experience in high school with a piece by Olivier Messiaen, which is his most probably famous piece of music, the Quartet for the End of Time. And, I grew up with classical music and then also, whatever rock music or vernacular music that we listened to and that I was involved with. But I'd never heard anything, and including, modern 20th century music. But I'd never heard a piece like this before, the Quartet for the End of Time. It has, deep religious significance. It's an instrumental piece of chamber music, but each movement, and we could talk for a long time about this piece, but each movement has a long title that makes reference to the apocalypse and to different religious themes that would be familiar to many people. But I found the music to actually be kind of funny sounding and kind of, uplifting and yet goofy at the same time. I don't know what word to describe it. And I had been used to, of course, the religious music of Bach was my favorite, and it was music that I grew up with and that I knew really well, and which is, Bach's music is very serious and very cathartic, I think is the way we would describe it. And here in Messiaen was a music that was, sort of modernist and using modernist techniques, but also had a kind of a wacky appeal to it. And so that was very interesting to me. Later in graduate school, I wrote a paper for Perspectives in New Music that expanded on this experience that I had with Messiaen and with other pieces by Messiaen, another one called Et Expecto Resurrectionem Mortuorum for concert band, essentially, that I actually heard the Juilliard band play in 1989. But as I delved into Messiaen's sort of musical theology, what I discovered, he describes 4 different kinds of religious music. And one of them is liturgical music, which in the circles, because he was a Catholic organist by profession, in addition to being a composer, he felt that liturgical music was essentially Gregorian chant. Then he talked about, it's 3. Then he talked about religious music, which would be music that's not liturgical in nature. And he mentioned specifically Bach, the Passions and the cantatas and things like that. Even though in Bach's religious experience, at least the cantatas were liturgical music that was performed in church. And then he had a third designation, which of course, he had a bit of an ego. He used to describe his own music of colors. And so he felt that this was the highest form of sort of spiritual music, was music that colors standing in, I believe, for a physical manifestation, the most vivid physical manifestation of spiritual reality, I guess. And he also had synesthesia. So Messiaen had in his mind, colors and sounds, or at least pitches and timbres, were kind of mixed together in a very interesting way. And so his music is quite interesting in that way. Anyway, when I think about art as spiritual inquiry, this is what's a piece that made me think about these things? I think of Messiaen's music. For these reasons, it opened me up to different ways of thinking about spirituality and thinking about religious music, and it helped me to think about, again, these 3 sort of levels of at least music, to my mind. In my case, liturgical music would certainly, in the Mormon context, be the hymns of the church, and that, the allowable liturgical music sort of expands and contracts, mostly contracts, I think, within the church. And I could talk for a long time about that subject. I've got lots of opinions about it, lots of opinions about a lot of things. But But then religious music, and I've written many, many hymns. None of them have been, taken up by the church, but they're there if you're interested in them. And then religious music, music maybe for concert use or other use that has religious themes or that explores religious themes. Very important part of my music, certainly, and music that I'm fascinated with. And then music of colors, which, of course, I don't have synesthesia, and I don't even have a good color, memory. I won't remember what color someone's wearing, after I turn away, or what color a piece of furniture that's been in my house for 20 years is. So that's not part of my experience, but in terms of music that doesn't have a specific religious reference, but that has spiritual significance, that's certainly something that I've experienced. But what I kind of want to get down to is, what I want to say is I'm basically an animist, in addition to being a Mormon. So the question about spirituality and music is, to me, it's not even a question. Like, I don't imagine music making or any human activity as being anything other than spiritual. And I think it's only in the context of our sort of modernist, sort of post-Protestant world where we have this fear of superstition, or wherever this came from. We can trace this to a lot of places, but where spirituality and the existence of spirits and spiritual forces and spiritual entities is sort of an other. It's something that's extra to our experience. And we as Mormons, probably talk about it a little more than our fellow, I don't know, Northern European, American, whatever we're describing ourselves as. But when I was in New York, I spent 1 year as an ethnomusicology major. I didn't do very well in that discipline. But the one thing I discovered is that spirituality in music is not even something that you would question or say, hey, should we bring spirituality into music pretty much anywhere in the world, again, other than this kind of industrialized, information-dense world where I think we've forgotten how important spirituality is. If I use, Mormon theology is very important to me, but it's not, again, in as much as Mormonism is the sort of bringing together of all things, the restoration of all things, this idea of dualism, that everything, not just humans, but other organisms and supposedly inanimate objects are animated by an essence, by a spiritual essence. I believe in that, and I think the Pearl of Great Price sort of describes that, and I believe that in a very vivid way. And when you open yourself up, I think spiritually, it's not hard to experience that. So, I start with that, but then also I think of art as, I think of Mormonism also describing, in the Doctrine and Covenants 93, physical and the spiritual brought together. That experience is what brings the ultimate joy, the ultimate fulfillment of being alive. And that's what art does. And, if you're an artist, this is, again, an experience that I have of having a spiritual creation or having some kind of inspiration, and nobody can really, we try to describe where art comes from, where inspiration comes from, and my sort of secular colleagues try to come up with, materialist or organic origins of that, but it's not convincing at all. It's very mysterious. And, this is part of why I think the spiritual realm is not describable using, terms using the five senses. It always has to be described using metaphor. And so, again, I think of animism, even the most, what might seem like the goofiest animist explanation of reality, using metaphor or using gods or spirits or things like that, to me, this is an attempt, just like Mormonism's attempt, to describe the world of the spirit, which is not, it's very difficult to describe. So metaphor ends up being the best way to do it. So I think I'm out of time. Then finally, I guess I would say, so the idea of spirituality and art, or spiritual inquiry, I guess I would also talk about the question of inquiry, because that's suggestive to me of information, which I think art can be a conveyor of information, but at its core, to me, it's more vivid as, I would say, art as an organism. Because again, if I think of, organisms as essentially being dual beings, having a spirit and a body and a life force, to my mind, a work of art has those same qualities. That's what, makes a work of art that is beautiful, that's vivid, sort of come alive, is that it actually, to my mind, is alive. It's something that humans have, created, that has its own, that emanates its own light to a certain extent. And then, the last thing I would say is, going back to Doctrine and Covenants 93, this question of bringing the physical and the spiritual together to create something perfect. There's another composer that I admire, Harry Partch, who talked about corporeality in music, and that music that becomes too intellectual is a problem. And he wanted to get people up off their chairs and get them to, sort of move in a musical experience. Anyway, that term corporeality, which I guess is just physicality, but I guess that's where I would reconfigure the title of this, art as spiritual/corporeal, as a spiritual/corporeal organism, rather than art as spiritual inquiry. But I do like that title. But that's my title for what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Amy Easton-Flake teaches ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, but her own research interests are in 19th century women's reform literature, which seems like a few centuries apart from one another, but she brings them together. I'm very happy she agreed to come. I've known her very little, but I've come to like the way she thinks. So Amy Flake, I'll ask you to speak to us.
Okay, here we are. Okay, welcome everyone. I really was excited that Richard asked me to come and speak today. So I'm going to be beginning with Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is one of my favorite authors. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the best-selling novel in the 19th century, second only to the Bible. And this is what she said about the connection between religion and literature. She said, "It is now understood that whoever wishes to gain the public ear and to propound a new theory must do it in a serial story. Have anyone in our day, as in St. Paul's, a psalm, a doctrine, a tongue, a revelation, an interpretation? For with you wraps it up in a serial story and presents it to the public. We have Romanism, Protestantism, high church and low church, and no church, contending with each other in serial stories, where each side converts the other according to the faith of the narrator. Soon it will be necessary that every leading clergyman should embody in his theology a serial story to be delivered from the pulpit Sunday after Sunday." Stowe's anti-slavery novel really exemplifies this statement. Before it ran in 1851, basically like Northerners accepted slavery or they looked the other way. Abolitionists were considered radical and extreme. But after her novel, she really did transform the American public and the way they thought about these things as she converted them not only to anti-slavery, but also to her version of Christianity. And for Stowe's novel was revolutionary at the time because of its depictions of slaves as real and heroic individuals, but also for how it redefines Christianity. Stowe clearly cast Tom as a Christ figure who dies so that others might live. He endures horrific beatings to spare others, and in the reality of the black slave being whipped by an overseer, we are to see the suffering face of Jesus, as we see depicted here. Stowe rejects masculine reason and dry theology to present a Christianity based on feelings, actions, suffering, and pure, unselfish love. Women and blacks are the instruments of salvation history, and people will be judged according to how they treat the poor. Uncle Tom's Cabin and her other works are replete with biblical quotes and allusions, and in her writings, we see how Stowe negotiated the theology of her day and imagined a Christianity that actually speaks to her and her circumstances. Now, of course, Stowe is not alone in doing this. Many of the greatest works of literature are works of spiritual inquiry, and so I just grabbed images of a few of them. John Milton, Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, many of Shakespeare's works, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, William Faulkner, Absalom, of course, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and my personal favorite, Dostoevsky's masterpiece with this scene in it of the Grand Inquisitor. So as we can see, literature really has just been seen as a natural mode of spiritual inquiry. So I wanted to just spend a few seconds just thinking about why is that? Why is this a place where people have turned to ask these questions? And so as I thought about it, I was thinking about how, first of all, like works of art satisfy human needs. They sensitize people to their external and their internal environments and to the connections between these environments. Second, literature helps us represent unfamiliar situations. It prepares our minds for fuller understanding. It connects people to greater realms and ideas. Since the most ancient of days, powerful insights have been imparted through the storytellers. Third, literature provides a space for us to imagine alternative ways of being, alternative solutions and possibilities. And this is what I love to look at in the 19th century women that I study and that I look at is how do they use literature as a place to negotiate things and to kind of come to these senses of what they're trying to get at. So in the short time that I have with you today, I want to just look at one more example of Stowe's work before I turn to some examples of 19th century Mormon women's poetry. So in the summer of 1857, Harriet Beecher Stowe's favorite son died. He died drowning. And what added to Stowe's anguish at this moment was her religious Calvinist upbringing, breached by her father, Lyman Beecher, which basically said that her son was damned for all eternity. And this is no mere abstraction for Stowe. Like, she deeply believes this. And in her letters where she preserves kind of her memories of this time, there's a deep personal anguish. And you see her trying to satisfy this contradiction that she sees between her Calvinist upbringing and her own belief that Jesus would not do that. And so you see her working through this. So not surprisingly, the work of fiction that she writes right after this time is A Minister's Wooing. And in the center of this story is a young man who dies lost at sea and presumably unconverted. And so this story is kind of her way of negotiating and providing the needed space to kind of work through this anguish. And it really is her spiritual inquiry that I want to discuss today. So the Calvinist theology of her youth is represented by a man named Reverend Hopkins. He preaches abstract ideas of disinterested benevolence, a love free of self-interest, which comes only as divine gift. He preaches also eternal punishment for the unconverted. And he leaves the mourners of this man with no hope, no grace, and no peace. And what I love is that who kind of represents Stowe and her views on this is Candace, a black serving woman. And she is the one who preserves the requisite solace that this woman, this mother needs and the other people. And so what she says to this woman is she says, "Now, honey, I know our Dr. Hopkins is a mighty good man and learned. He has mighty big things to say. But honey, that won't do for you now. At times like this, there's just one thing to come to, and that's Jesus. Just come right down to where poor old Candace has to stay always. It's a good place, darling. Look right at Jesus. Tell you, honey, you can't live no other way now. Don't you remember how he looked on his mother when she stood fainting and trembling on the cross, just like you? He knows all about mothers' hearts. He won't break yours. I'm clear Master James is one of the elect, and I'm clear that there's considerable more of the elect than people think. Why, Jesus didn't die for nothing. All that love won't be wasted. The elect are more than you or I know, honey. There's the Spirit. He'll give it to him. And if Master James is called and taken, depend upon it. The Lord got him ready. Of course he has. So don't go laying on your poor heart what no mortal creature can live under. There's just but one thing remaining, the cross of Christ. If God so loves us, if he died for us, greater love hath no man than this. If there's a fathomless mystery of sin and sorrow, there's a deeper mystery of God's love. So Mary, try Candace's way. I look at Christ. Many things about this moment are significant. First, it shows us how Stowe has found a way to be Christian apart from the New England theology of her youth. Second, it shows us how Stowe resolved her fear of her son's death by concluding that salvation was given to all who sincerely opened their hearts. Her solutions and her problems of salvation was a sacrament of love taught by Christ. Third, it is one example of the many instances where Stowe dismisses clergymen as the saviors of soul and replaces them with women. Throughout her novel, Stowe replaces the Puritan salvation formulation with her own. She stresses the necessity of suffering, human love, childlike simplicity, and Bible study with her own heart consciousness. These comprise the sure paths to salvation, a liberation which found its stamp in the performance of the work for the good of others, and that was best exemplified in women's self-sacrificing, Christ-like love. If we had more time, I would look at one of my favorite works of Stowe, which is her Women in Salvation History, where she basically goes through and rewrites Old Testament and New Testament narratives of women to basically give them a voice and to show kind of how her Christian theology and what she's thinking and kind of mediating that through the women and really giving voice to, again, her own thoughts and how women should be playing a role in the spiritual lives. Since time is short, though, I am going to move on to 19th century Mormon women. Bushman, Richard, had asked us to kind of present our own kind of works of spiritual inquiry, but I am not an artist like my fellow panelists, I am really a scholar, and I'm a literary critic. But again, the women that I study are the women who are doing spiritual inquiry. It's their studies, it's how they kind of mediate faith. And so I wanted to share just a couple of my favorite examples from 19th century Mormon women and their poetry, and how it really shows kind of the inquiry that they're going through. I begin by looking at a poem where women are fleshing out vague doctrine surrounding premortal existence with God. And one of the most prevalent images in this poetry is of individuals being taught by heavenly parents in an atmosphere of love and joy. Here we read, "Dost remember the palace where primeval you strayed, the gardens of grandeur where soft breezes played? Or father or mother in whose courts you were reared, with love past revealing and nothing was feared?" The poems become more interesting when we note the prominent place that they accord women in friendship. A mother in heaven is present in the majority of these poems. And our mother, queen in heaven, smiled on us, every one. Smiled on each Eve, each Sarah, Rachel, Rebecca, and Ruth, Elizabeth, Mary, and Martha, each daughter that stood for truth. As this stanza demonstrates, not just Heavenly Mother, but also women as her daughters are at the center of these authors' images of premortal existence, illustrating how these women often use poetry to place women at the center rather than at the periphery. Interestingly, the bond most commonly mentioned among humanity in these poems is not familial, but friendship, suggesting how important female camaraderie was for these women. Many poems speak of the friendships established in premortality as the basis for their friendships here. So when we met in earth life, the same old kinship true brought each unto the other. A mystic tie drew me to you. And through these poems, we can really see how women are creating and advocating a theology that was meaningful and useful for their lived experience. I want to close with one last example. Death, suffering, and trials were an ever-present reality for 19th century Mormons. And an implicit question running through the countless poems of mourning and suffering is the unanswerable question of why. The Mormons, like most individuals of faith in 19th century America, declared suffering to be a vital part of obtaining salvation in the next life. In their poetry, we can see how Mormons struggled to reconcile their belief in themselves as God's chosen people with their constant trials. Why do misfortunes encompass the just? Why are we smitten, the weary ones cry? Show us the reason, the wherefore, and why. One of the most intriguing poems that deal with this theme is Not on the Lintel by E.T., because it mediates the pain of losing a child through the biblical story of Moses' final plague on the Egyptians. E.T. highlights the concepts of chosenness by her surprising choice to identify with the Egyptians rather than the Israelites, who are typically the source of identification for Mormons. Quote, "Tonight my neighbor is weeping, for the destroyer in passing o'er found there no mark of sacrifice on the lintel of the door. So passing through the unguarded door, he found a blossom fair, touched it with his chilling breath, shrouding life with the gloom of death, leaving desolation there." By framing a child's death within this biblical story, the writer seems to be trying to make sense of what seems to be a cold, heartless decision on behalf of God. Her faith will not allow her to find fault with God, so instead she is forced to find some level of fault with herself and her neighbors. Like the Egyptians, they must lack the mark of sacrifice. E.T. empathizes and identifies with the bereaved mother. Quote, "Tonight I might weep with my neighbor," because she recognizes that she too has not made the needed sacrifice to merit the mark to save. And at any time, death might come into her life as well. This feeling explicitly expressed runs implicitly throughout the poems of mourning, serving as parts of a driving cathartic force that brings these women together in a community because of the possibility that death can come at any time. That the author does not see herself and her neighbors as meriting the mark to save raises intriguing questions about how Mormons actually saw themselves. Although Mormons commonly refer to themselves as the children of Israel or God's chosen people, how many individuals actually felt that they qualified for this distinction and corresponding blessing? Many questions and insights such as this arise when we take the time to explore 19th century Mormon women's poems. For then, as now, literature provides an essential space for individuals to explore questions of spirituality, to imagine alternative ways of being, alternative solutions and possibilities, and to find the answers to our deepest spiritual yearnings. Thank you.
Marvelous. Finally, we'll hear from Brian Kershisnik, who's led a colorful life. He grew up all over the world, went to school in many places, finally came to college in the University of Utah and BYU, and then did graduate work at the University of Texas. I think we know him primarily as a painter. I think his works are among the best known, the most easily recognizable work that's being done by contemporary Mormon painters. So we're very happy to have Brian here to talk to us today.
One of the roles of human creation in any form is revealing the religion of the human. When I use the term religion, I include everything from devoted worship to denial of anything supernatural. This occurs not in 3 or 4 examples, but in 300 or 400 or 3,000 or 4,000. This slow revelation is not necessarily in the ways intended by the human creator, but in their actual, often subconscious core intentions. The outward intentions may even be to conceal the core. Although authentic intentions can change, they rarely change much or very fast. Change usually affects first the superficial actions and much more slowly the core. Even in discipleship, we spend more attention on altering the superficial, but repentance is not about the superficial, it is about altering the core. I suspect this figures into Jesus' admonishing us to judge not, essentially because we are so very, very clueless about people's cores. Much of the conversation about anyone's work seldom delves much below the level of the relative success or failure in achieving one's stated objectives. I believe that notwithstanding all that is said by and about a human creator, what the work actually accomplishes is below or beyond the control of the human maker. Great works of art in any field accomplish far more than their creators intended. I am consistently and profoundly moved spiritually by the works of scoundrels. I believe there is a parallel in discipleship. Indeed, I believe discipleship to be a spectacularly creative medium filled with feints, attempted and abandoned shortcuts, unanticipated victories, and bewildering mistakes before we find our way to our way. The things we do are extremely important, but what we really are is ultimately the great and terrifying mystery to be finally disclosed when we, quote, know even as also we are known. So I'm going to hurry through a couple of, this and talk about some of these. I had a hard time paring them down. So this is a painting called Refusal to be Healed. And it was on the wall of the studio for years, and there was no injury here. It was a man reaching out to heal a woman, and she was, in my mind, refusing to be healed, and it was just a stupid picture. I could never, that's often the sense that I have. It wasn't working. It wasn't working until, on a whim, I decided to injure the man, so it suddenly became ambiguous as to who was healing who was needing healing, who was refusing to be healed, and then it became much more of a human experience. I related to it much more. I feel like that the things that affect me in art are I have to approach my easel with questions rather than feeling like I'm going to deliver an answer to you, because if I'm trying to deliver an answer, I'm too inclined to be concerned about what I want you to think of me. Instead, I have to go with an inquiry, and hopefully all of us learn something along the way. This is a painting called it's called The Man Watching, which you will recognize as the title of a Rilke poem. This painting, again, for years, was a man falling. There was no angel in it. And I knew there was something there, but I didn't know what to do. I just kept on putting him on the easel and putting him back on the wall. And Faith, in a very early, we were dating, she brought the Rilke poem to the studio. And it became kind of the thing that unlocked this poem, or this painting. If you are unfamiliar with the poem, you got to check it out. The conclusion is that, and I'm paraphrasing a translation. Forgive me, you who speak German, but in the end, he says, victory, in referring to the prophets fighting with angels, he says, victory does not tempt this man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by ever greater opponents. This is a painting some of you know. It's called Jesus and the Angry Babies. It emerged from all of the pictures of cherubic children on Jesus' lap, and I have children, and I know that is not the case. They were not all well behaved. They were not all happy to be there. It was Mom's idea, and they didn't know this guy. So anyway, it just felt. I felt like initially I thought this was funny, and it is funny. But it became a much better metaphor for our relationship to Jesus, his tolerance of us, his exasperation, our misbehavior with each other, all in this context of him trying to bring us in. Yeah, this is Holy Family with an angry baby, so I suppose that's Jesus, who, of course, would have been upset, from time to time, and dirty and such. This is a painting called Divine Intervention. An experience I had in doing some research, and the sensation that the intrusion from the other world was that there were actually people policing it and holding the beings back. We want the access. We want the access. I think if we got all of the access that they want to give us, our heads would explode. And that was the experience that this guy. I think I've got a couple of good policemen who help me out, keep my head from exploding. It explodes anyway sometimes. This is a painting called Looking for Something. And, perhaps you'll understand something. And this is called At Table. And this refers to the sense that I have. I mean, not only to the beauty and sacredness of the sacrament table, but the holy ordinance of sitting down and eating food with people you love, the mess and beauty and trouble and difficulty and holiness of that experience. This is called Find Me. Anyway, we can talk about that. This is a painting called An Issue of Blood, and it refers to the story in the New Testament of the woman who touched the hem of his garment. And what I love about this painting is I don't know which one is Jesus. I don't know which one is the woman. It was a remarkable story in that if you were 3 feet away from the event, you might have missed the whole thing, and I think that. And now these are a couple of non-Mormon artists, a couple of scoundrels. Actually, I don't know if Giotto was a scoundrel. I'll talk about him a little later, but I think that history indicates that there were some difficulties in the personal life of Gauguin, but this painting is called Vision After the Sermon, and the thing that I love, I'll show you the other painting too, and we'll kind of go back and forth. This is Giotto's reunion of Joaquin and Anna. It's from a cycle from the story of the parents of Mary. And I don't know the source of those stories. I kind of grew up assuming that they were made up, but I don't know the source of the stories about the parentage of Mary. But this painting, I mean, from the first time I saw it, just embodied so profoundly the overarching aspect of the message of Christ that is a reunion, that what we are striving for, what we're reaching for, what we never quite get a hold of in this life, even with those who are closest to us, is an ultimate reunion. At the end of my statement, I mentioned that line from Corinthians about we will know even as also we are known. A beautiful thing about that scripture is, it says, "For now we see through a glass darkly," which of course we know to be a mirror. For now we're looking at a mirror in a dark room. We cannot even see ourselves. But then face to face, it says, then we will see even ourselves. Now we know in part, but then we shall know even as also we are known. I'm sorry if I'm misquoting it, but there's something about whether or not the story itself is true. There's something about the beautiful human connection of Anna and Joaquin. I don't know much about their story. I should find out, but I don't have to know about their story to feel this. That Giotto understood something about this separation and reunion that just informs my discipleship. And in Gauguin's Vision After the Sermon, these people, after a sermon about Jacob wrestling the angel, he's painting an account that he had heard. But the way he kind of the way his work does kind of changes the world into this mythological space, and all these people with their eyes closed having the shared experience speaks something to what I feel like happens to us, happens to saints when they get together and share the experience. An otherworldly experience, we were not there to witness, but we do witness it, and we do feel it, and we do believe it, and we do join together with that. And I just saw this recently. It's in Edinburgh, and there's this beautiful, the National Gallery in Edinburgh is this wonderful, manageable museum. It's small. The Met just kind of overwhelms you fantastically, and I love to go there and get destroyed by it again and again. But in Edinburgh, there's a nice little one, and it's full of really great pieces, including this one.
Well, these were all terrific presentations. I'd like to hear from some of you a statement you have about art as a spiritual experience, or questions you have for one of our panelists today. Would you stand up so we can hear you a little better? Here's a mic for you.
I love the idea, Brian, that you commented on of being impressed or delighted, or what your word was, by the art of scoundrels. And I know I hear a lot of times when people well, I know about that artist, I know about his personal life, so I hate him, I don't want to live with any of his stuff, and just to reaffirm that idea that art, the whole concept of art, like poetry, is a starting point. It's a key to the mind and the spirit of the observer and the reader, and you take flight from the roost created by the artist. So I'd like to thank you for saying that so succinctly, and it really resonates with me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a lovely thought.
Question for everyone in general, or everyone on the panel in general. A lot of times the Mormon Church has used art as a way of providing answers, whether in missionary efforts or in Sunday school. We're basically trying to provide answers, as was mentioned earlier. In the quest for inquiry of raising questions rather than answering them, do you see, in what way do you see the art being able to still fill those roles of teaching its people and reaching outward beyond the way that we currently answer with art? Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Or was that sort of-
I think you're saying in our move to sort of art as a question, can art still help provide answers? Is that what you're saying?
Or what role could it play in missionary efforts?
Yeah. If you're trying to teach someone the gospel,
Yeah, does raising questions help?
yeah, that really wants to know about the gospel, does your art help them to know the gospel better? Christian, did you raise your hand?
Well, I guess I'm going to go in the opposite direction and say, because music is my thing, and to me, music has gotten so didactic, and we're on the cusp of a new hymn book and such. To me, music should be, it's the hallelujah, it's the Hosanna, it's an act of praise and worship first and foremost. I think of just being alive as an act of celebration, of joy. That's where I would start with, I think, with most art forms. And then being able to teach or evangelize or again, in music being used as a mimetic aid to say, do what is right, let the consequence follow. I think that's a great thing to remember, I wish that were being thought by more people right now. But to me, it has to start with the ineffable, with the part that talking and writing essays and things like that can't do.
Did you get that in saying that teaching the gospel may not always be giving a set of answers, but sort of a way to ask questions and pursue spiritual issues?
I think it'll be a minute before that. I'm sorry, I'm not sure who asked the question. Oh, I think it'll be a minute before the official church would use works like that for proselyting. Proselyting, you use a certain kind of work that accomplishes a certain thing, and that's not what I don't see the Mormon Art Center as wanting to enlarge the body of that work. But the conversation among humans, the conversation at dinner, the conversation among friends, the conversations at museums, et cetera, that truth is built by those kinds of conversations too. So.
I sometimes, you were always talking about how do you do missionary work in church, and I sometimes say your best resource are your problems. That if you talk to people about your real struggles, and they see you using your religion to try to cope with these difficulties overwhelm us, it's going to be more appealing than if we have a cheery face and answers to everything you can think of. Other questions?
I have a comment for Brian. Having a mind full of questions, and I say this dripping with sarcasm, thank you for adding who are Mary's parents to that list of unanswered questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Nathan.
Question for Christian. So I really like the idea of talking about art as a
spiritual and physical element. I think it's very easy to only engage with the physical element of a work of art, especially if we're unfamiliar with the form or the structure of it. What tools do you think you could suggest for how to engage with the spiritual element of art that we're unfamiliar with?
Oh, that's a hard one. You mean in terms of like what we do, like music theory and analysis and things like that?
Because I'm a musician, if I look at a painting, there are times when it just happens, when I can be aesthetically moved by something. But if there's something, how do I get past a physical understanding to get to a spiritual understanding of work that I'm unfamiliar with?
Other than, listening to it and engaging and opening yourself up to it. I mean, this is why, I'm also a part-time music theorist. I mean, that's what I teach. And I think music theory is kind of diseased as a discipline because it focuses on, music is such again, I think of it as a spiritual / physical thing. And, I sort of view our experience as being in three realms: physical, spiritual, and symbolic. And people with PhDs and like that are really into the symbolic part of life to the sort of elimination of the other two, and they kind of substitute functions that the spiritual and physical parts of life that we require to kind of be alive. Now, music theorists more so than any other, group of people, because they're trying desperately to come up with a way to describe patterns that exist in music that would somehow either be evidence of some divine presence, or to eliminate the possibility that there is a divine presence, to explain, a piece of music that's sort of universally moving, powerful, and say, oh, it's in the formula. There's something in the numbers, in the notes, or something. And anyway, I'm just kind of stalling here because I don't know, but I think I'd have to start with the corporeality that I was talking about music is to me a portal to the spirituality of music. So surrendering to the physical experience it's the same thing with visual art to my mind, or even with literature, even though literature is it is symbols, but there's something beautiful about the letters of the alphabet and about human speech and the phonemes that surrender yourself to that experience. And I think the spiritual will come about. That's the place.
My question is actually for Amy. I was really moved by the poetry that you shared and wondered where the best places to go for more of that. Where can I find it?
Well, hopefully in the next So right now, that's actually my most recent project, is I'm putting together like Mormon women's exponent poetry, and so hopefully in the next year, it'll just be widely out there. You can go and get a book of it. But even before then, though, you can just go. I love the women's exponent. It's my favorite resource. And if you go there, every single issue has 2 or 3 poems, and you just start reading. You can go online, type in women's exponent, it will come up, and you can just start reading it. So. Yeah, so you can go into the archives and just see all of it, and it's fabulous.
Is Women Exponent
Can I
online?
just add?
Yes,
that
it is
there's
online.
already a women's anthology of poetry. It is edited by
Yes.
Susan Elizabeth Howe. That's
Thank
an
you.
excellent resource.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, it's an amazing resource. It's really
There's
great.
an anthology of poetry by 19th and 20th century women, Mormon women,
Yeah.
edited by Susan Elizabeth Howe. I can't remember the title.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more. Sharon.
Well, my question is also for Amy, and I was struck by the opening that talked about a narrative series as being part of the preaching. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, the topic has been art as spiritual inquiry, and you can take this in a couple directions, whatever you like. What about stories as spiritual inquiry, or what about art as stories, and what role do stories play in spirituality?
Yeah. that's what I love, and that's what I really study, is just how stories are integral, right, for us to like making sense of anything. I think this is how we can read the Bible. That's how we read the Book of Mormon, is like looking at the stories they share, and it's them trying to mediate and to understand God. And that's really, again, what Harriet Beecher Stowe is really proposing, is saying, okay, it is only in these stories, and as we discuss these things, that we try and reason and make it our kind of our connections and our understanding of God. So I would just say I think stories are just absolutely central to this moment of spiritual inquiry, and it is for all of us, right? I mean, that's the thing, is I think every single day we're telling our stories, and that's how we connect with God. That's how we make sense of our own spiritual experience, or through these stories. And so again, I just love like studying 19th century women of all different faith denominations and seeing how they're doing that. So
Well, thanks to our panel, and thank you all for being here. Come back at 2. We have more of the same high quality. So thank you all.